Talking how to get a six pack. We are live. Got 5 tips for you, and we are starting right now. What is going on? My name is David Barr. If you are looking to get bigger, faster, stronger, get leaner, go longer, hit that subscribe and then the little bell so you don't miss the latest tips and tricks. And today I was going to go with 6 tips for a six pack, but that's just way too much for us. I mean, we're only human, so need to pull back a little bit and just go with 5 tips. This one kicked off because you see too many people with their shirts off taking themselves way too seriously on YouTube, so I had to counter that a bit, and hopefully the thumbnail reflects that. We'll get to that in a second. But starting off, we have a lot of experts to go through. A lot of people influenced me for this one, so I want to have a nice scientific breakdown, but something that's also applicable. So we'll not only go through what I learned from the experts, but we'll also go through a 3-step checklist, a walkthrough at the very end, because I don't want to just spit info at you, right? I don't want to just lob info bombs and hope you catch them. I really want to make sure that you're able to apply this information. So we'll go through that 3-step walkthrough at the very end, okay? Again, we are live. It is allergy season, so anything could happen here. This could get crazy. So moving on to the next slide. Talking about the neural link of the abs. And this one came from Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, absolute rock star. Probably familiar with him. If not, look up his stuff. It is great. And back in the day, he answered a critical question about abs. Do we actually have lower and upper abs? What do you think? Turns out we do, and he answered this in a very, very rational way. The way he sought to answer this was not by subjective feel, by looking at just various studies of over contractility. He looked at something deeper. He went into the nerve supply, and it turns out that we actually have different nerves innervating or activating the upper and the lower abs. So what this means to you in terms of practical application is that you want to make sure that you are using exercises, movements that affect the sternal portion and the lumbopelvic girdle. Okay, so the upper abs and the lower abs, respectively. And this is something you always need to be careful of. This is not direct advice. This is just how to look at abs if you're trying to optimize your training routine. Okay, so look at those 2 different types of movements, and they will impact your abs differently. So make sure you incorporate both, provide that you're healthy. Okay, moving on. What is the next slide? Where is it coming from? All right, well, this is, okay. Obviously we're live, so I can't get too serious about this. And this is really the whole point. You can't be taken seriously when you got your shirt off and you're doing a pose. I just, it's one of those things. It doesn't matter what the info is that you're giving. As soon as your shirt's off and you're doing some kind of ab pose, I don't know, man. The credibility just, it doesn't necessarily go out the window, but you got to take it with a grain of salt, right? So hopefully this type of self-deprecating, dry, sarcastic sense of humor, which I call the Canadian trifecta, hopefully this adds a bit of levity to the situation, because it's an otherwise potentially very dry topic. So again, just being silly. I mean, don't get me wrong, not too bad for a meathead in his 40s who lifts a couple times a week, doesn't train abs or diet or anything like that, but still, it's meant to add some levity, so don't take it too seriously. The next part. Okay, so there are 3 movements that you can do to test your ab strength, because remember, your abs, that six-pack, it's not just going to be comprised of your rectus abdominis. I'm not even talking about the TA or transverse abdominis. There's a lot more going on there. And there's different ways to evaluate your strength and then tailor your programming based on that. So this first one comes from Tyler Christensen when he was working at the NSCA running the tactical program there. Great guy, very knowledgeable, and he kept emphasizing something called Janda's cross or Janda's cross. I know it's going to be wrong either way, so I'll just say Janda. But kept talking about Janda's cross, and eventually he kept hammering this home so hard that eventually I just had to look this up, and it was really good stuff. But what I found in the course of that research was looking at something called Janda sit-ups. And it was actually based on a physiological principle called reciprocal inhibition. Pretty simple concept. All it means is that when you're activating a prime mover, a main muscle group, the opposing muscle shuts down. So if you're doing a biceps curl, you want your triceps to shut down so they don't act as a braking force, right? So pretty basic concept. But to apply this to abs changes a lot. And the reason is because if we can activate our hamstrings when we are training our abs, we can shut down our hip flexors through that reciprocal inhibition. So we get more stress, more of that positive training induced stress that we want on the rectus abdominis, on the abs. So going into that one movement way beyond the scope of this particular video, but be sure to check that out. All you're doing is anchoring your feet, anchoring your hamstrings, hard to say for some reason, but you can use it with some kind of band. That's ideal. You can use the Pavelizer, which comes from Pavel Satsulin from back in the day, if you remember that one. But there's different ways of doing this, and it's very effective, again, for activating that RA, or even just testing how strong are your rectus abdominis, that six-pack, compared to your hip flexors. What happens when you take your hip flexors out of it? That's a big one. So the next one comes from my early strength and conditioning experience at the University of Waterloo, UW. And at the time, I basically knew everything there was to know about training. It was awesome. I basically memorized Arnold's Encyclopedia of Modern Bodybuilding. So there really wasn't too much more for me to learn. And I got a brutal introduction to strength and conditioning when I saw athletes, in particular basketball athletes, doing this weird type of crunch. They had one hip flexed, one knee flexed, and the other leg was fully extended straight out in front of them. And Dr. Jonathan Fowles, who was my mentor at the time, introduced me to the world of strength and conditioning. He explained to me that the huge professor at UW, Dr. Stu McGill, if you're not familiar with this stuff, be sure to check that out. He is like the god of the core. He is a rock star, great guy. He came up with this idea of bracing the core and contracting the abs. And it's a little more sport specific. And hey, that was not in Arnold's encyclopedia. So right away I knew, wow, I knew basically nothing. I went from feeling like I knew everything to basically realizing I know nothing. And that's a very humbling experience, but I would submit it's something very positive for us to go through as well. Not great at the time, but lesson learned. So take a look at these. Again, can't go into the detail, but you can find it online. A great way to test our overall core strength and our ab strength in a different position. So take a look. Take a look. Okay, we're live, like I said. Okay. All right. So this comes from my work at the NSCA, and there was a conference being put on. Absolute rock star, as pretty much everybody that has influenced me is. Really appreciate that, which is why I'm calling them out here. Dr. J. Dawes, again, just a great guy. And he was giving a presentation. It was actual live session. So he was walking through people how to do a movement called the Turkish Get Up, or TGU for short. And he was doing something weird because there was a ton of people doing this outside on the field at NSCA headquarters. We didn't have enough dumbbells, kettlebells, that kind of thing to go around. So he recommended to start off, to really nail down the technique for this, use your shoe. Hold your shoe above your head when you're doing this. And if you're not familiar with it, no worries, just check it out. 7-step process. Very, very impactful and a great way to test your abs. Case in point, I had done this before. It wasn't a big deal, so I decided to play ball, just have some fun with it. Threw my shoe up, lying on my back, trying to get up. I could not get up. I could not curl up for the very first part of the movement. Not because there was too much load above me. Again, I was just using my shoe. It was that there was clearly some kind of inactivation of my abs, and some component of my core was just shut down. So this was very, very telling. So it was only the first of 7 steps, right? That's a problem. So it's something I really worked on after that, you can break it down into different steps. Again, we can go into that in different videos, but the idea is to first find the flaw, okay? Find the inactivation, the inhibition, whatever it is, okay? So those are your 3 movements that you can use to test the various part of abs, and then incorporate those into your programming based on what you're actually after, okay? Okay, training the abs. How do we actually train the abs? Well, it seems like there's a lot of garbage floating around still coming from the Arnold's encyclopedia about ab training, about, you know, your 6-pack. There is a myth out there that the abs recover faster than everything else. So they need higher reps. You can train them more frequently. I mean, it's the nonsense goes on and on, but the reality is there's no direct evidence that I'm familiar with that indicates that abs are any different. So ideally, you would want to train them just like you would train anything else. And there is a catch to that. We will get to that exception. But what this means in terms of training frequency, train them like you train every other body part, especially if you're going to start training them harder, especially if you're going to start training them first in your routine. That is targeting them when you have the most energy. Often we train abs at the end of a session. They're kind of an afterthought, so they just don't get the stress stimulus that they deserve. They just don't get that impact that's going to cause them to have that adaptation growth response that we're typically after. So if you're training other body parts once every 5 days, give that a try with your abs, but make sure you're training your abs harder. Now, full disclosure, if you are currently in love with your everyday ab training program, 100 sit-ups a day, whatever the hell it is, that's great. Just keep doing what you're doing as long as it's safe and effective, not taking that away from you. So just keep doing what you like. But this is an alternative for people who are just getting started, or for people who are looking to take that next step, hit that next level of ab training and development, okay? So there are 2 components when it comes to hypertrophy, or the growth, that we're actually after. And some people are still surprised by this, that yes, we do actually want to hypertrophy or grow our rectus abdominis. It's not going to give you a distended belly. It's not something to worry about, but it will make your abs pop more, give that visual impression that we're really after. And the way to do this is you want to train sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, which is typically the way that people train abs. So higher reps, lower rest periods, that kind of thing. That's going to be a metabolic stress. The other way is the way that's typically neglected. That is myofibrillar hypertrophy. The way we get that is heavier loads, longer rest periods, and my favorite, eccentrics. Now, again, if you're healthy, this is something for you to investigate. This is not me telling you what to do. This is not giving a prescription. This is me just giving tips about what I found effective and what some of the research can show, extrapolated from a variety of different sources. Now, the trick is, for heavy ab training, you don't jump into eccentrics right away. The negatives, heavy negatives, don't jump into that right away, because you have to be careful about your hip flexor involvement, right? And this goes back to the Janda sit-ups, trying to inactivate those hip flexors. But when you see people doing abs and their lower back starts popping off the floor, that is a bad sign, because that means the hip flexors are being activated. We don't want that. That's going to take the tension off of your rectus abdominis. Okay, so keep the tension on the RA, the rectus abs, that 6-pack, and try to keep it off of your hip flexors. Activating your hip flexors isn't necessarily bad. It's just when we do it too much, that's where it starts to hurt our gains, essentially. So we don't want to do that. So be very careful of your hip flexor involvement. Have somebody watch you. Make sure you're aware of what's happening with your lower back at all times. You definitely don't want to have that arch. And then as you get stronger and stronger, you can start to incorporate more and more eccentrics into your program. And that's going to cause that myofibrillar hypertrophy. Now, when you're hitting the sarcoplasmic and the myofibrillar hypertrophy, that's where the real results are going to come. And I have other videos about that. I will talk about that more in those other videos. Okay, so this is where MNF comes in, and had a lot of great sources contributing to this video, to this live stream. And one of the guys who really got me starting to think about abs was not just a model for Muscle and Fitness. He was a huge selling cover model. And it was very cool because among my roles at Muscle and Fitness, online editor, science writer, I was also the tech advisor on video shoots and photo shoots. So I got to go on set and, just chat, talk shop with the guys for, hours at a time. And this guy was not just the cover model, he was the ab guy. He had the best abs. So whenever we had an ab shoot, we wanted that specificity. We would call up the ab guy and say, we need you on set. We need those abs. And what he told me, abs are made in the kitchen. And you've probably heard this before, no doubt, but that was the first time I had actually heard it. And what it means is really that abs come from your diet. They come from a reduction in body fat as well as the hypertrophy that you get from training. Now, the crazy part is why this was so impactful to me when he said it was the fact that he didn't train abs. This specific ab guy, this cover model, did not train abs at all. Okay, so obviously genetic freak, not taking anything away from that. He recognized that himself, but most of us are going to have to train abs, okay? We can't just get away with not training abs. So yes, abs are made in the kitchen, which means you have to watch your diet and try to drop back those calories if you're eating too much, but combining the training and the diet is really the best way to go. So with that in mind, one of the next steps for you to take is to figure out how to incorporate the diet into this. And I have a very specific video about that. 3 tips for fat loss, muscle growth, and it's really more designed around people who are focused on fat loss while trying to maintain or even build muscle. So fat loss is a key component there. And if you're after abs, this is exactly what you want. This is exactly what you're after. So I'll link to that. I'll link to that in the top right in the card, and I'll link to that in the description as well as at the end of the video. So be sure to check that one out. Okay, coming towards the end here, home stretch. We got to talk about fat burners. This whole concept is a mess. There is a fat burning diet, the keto diet, low carb, high fat, ketogenic diet. This is a fascinating metabolic, we'll say, intervention for the body. And a lot of people are very, very successful when it comes to weight loss, athletic performance, using a ketogenic diet. You basically become a fat burning machine. Problem is, it's not for everybody. The individual variability in responses is just massive. Okay, so not everybody's going to respond the same in spite of what you're hearing in the echo chambers, the online forums, the dogma, that kind of thing. So it's one of those things you may be interested in trying. And if you are, I have an offer. There's a free keto ebook available. Co-authored that with Anthony Almada, and it is available. I'll link to that in the description. So special thanks to Mike T. Nelson, Dr. Mike T. Nelson, for helping set all that up. And speaking of Dr. Mike T. Nelson, it was through some of our conversations that he really hammered home the idea that, yes, there are fat burner products on the market right now, but they really don't burn much fat, if any. What they do is they tend to make fat more available to be burned. So you have extra fat waiting to be burned, but it's not rate limiting to your fat loss, to your fat burning. It is that actual fat burning process that we're after. It's called fat oxidation. So if you have a lot of fat ready to be burned and it's not burned, it just gets restored. Okay, so fat burners really, again, just make fat more available to be burned. They don't actually increase the burning. So even if it's available for a little bit to be burned, then it's not burned, it just gets restored. Okay. Case in point, I actually use high dose niacin, vitamin B3, nicotinic acid, whatever you want to call it. So I can actually minimize that, what's called lipolysis process, that making fat available. And I found it's helpful for triglycerides, blood cholesterol levels, that kind of thing, but it's probably not going to impact overall fat loss. Okay, that's how irrelevant that lipolysis process is. We really want that fat oxidation or fat burning. Now, one thing I don't think I've talked about before on any of my videos, this is huge. You've probably heard of, we'll call it loosely, an amino acid called carnitine or L-carnitine. And this is available in so-called fat burner products, is promoted as a fat burner. The problem is we already have way too much of this stuff inside our cells. Our cells don't want any more. Talked about this a bit in the glutamine article, 5 tips for how to take glutamine. It is full. Our cells are full. They don't want any more. Okay. We have to get around that. So just dumping in more carnitine into our guts, it's not going to work. So if you're taking carnitine supplements, you're probably just peeing it out. And, you know, if you think it works, that's great. I'm just presenting the objective literature here. So the way to get around that, somewhat ironically, is by using a massive insulin spike. And I talk about this in relationship to some of my NASA research experience, some of my research with a radioactive poison. So I will link to that in a creatine video. I'll link to that again in the top right. Be sure to check that out, give you all the details, because we used to think that using, you know, 30 to 40 grams of a fast absorbing carbohydrate was going to do the trick. That's not the case. We need a lot more. We need, you know, 70, 80 grams of the fastest carbs to drive insulin up high enough to get that carnitine, drive that carnitine into our cells where it can have a powerful impact on fat burning. It is awesome. I think once this really catches on and people start using it correctly, activating the carnitine in a sense, I think it's going to have an impact on just overall fat loss that people experience. So 5 tips there, the next steps that you should be taking if you are healthy to try to make use of these tips. First one is test your abs, see where your strengths and weaknesses lie. So I like JMT, so using the Janda or Janda sit-ups, using the McGill sit-ups, and then testing the Turkish get-up, just because that was the most demanding for me. And that's where I found that, again, that shutdown in my core, that inactivation. So you can break up the testing into however you want, but based on the results of those tests, based on where your weaknesses lie, you can tailor your ab training based on that, right? That's the whole point. You don't just want to train where you're comfortable and where you have your strengths, right? You want to train those weaknesses, build those weaknesses up, turn them into strengths. That's how you're going to get that overall 6-pack development, right? Next one, you take that information that you got in step 1 and filter it through your training using the neural link. So we have our sternal and our pelvic components of the abs. So incorporating those two, as well as the sarcoplasmic and myofibrillar hypertrophy. So you have your movements, you have your different set and rep schemes, your loading, your rest periods. All of that is filtered through these 2 steps. Okay, filtered through that first testing step, and then the understanding of the different types of abs, or the, we'll say, different neural connections of the abs, and then the different ways of training them. Now, the third is going to be your diet evaluation, and this is huge. It's way too much for this video. So what I'm going to do is, again, I'll include a link to the video that you're going to want to look at. It's going to be that 3 fat loss muscle growth tips video. I'll link to it again, top right description. Definitely check that out. That is your third step to really activating your 6-pack, answering how to get a 6-pack. So there's your 3 steps. Please let me know what you think in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Get your tips. What are you doing for your abs? But that's it. We are live. Until next time, I'm David Barr, or David Barr, whatever. It's been a long video. Raise the bar.